Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's industry-presented webinar, New PAI Technology Prescribes Optimal Levels of Physical Activity to Protect Against Cardiovascular Disease. A few housekeeping things before we get started. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the question area within the GoToWebinar navigation, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. If your question goes unanswered, don't worry, we'll take all the questions from today's webinar and turn it into a Q&A blog that we'll post on the ACSM website. We also encourage you to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter by using the hashtag ACSMWebinar. Today's webinar is sponsored and presented by Mio Global. Mio Global is an industry leader in health technology with proprietary heart rate-based algorithms such as the groundbreaking activity metric Personal Activity Intelligence, or PAI. PAI is a scientifically validated score that empowers people with personalized insights into how much exercise they need to live a longer, healthier life. One continuing education credit, courtesy of Mio Global, will be emailed to all participants after the webinar, along with a PDF copy of today's presentation. You should receive the CEC and slides in an email tomorrow afternoon. There's no need to email ACSM asking about CEC credit. Today's webinar presenter is Dr. Carl Chip Levy. Dr. Levy attended medical school at LSU-MC in New Orleans, Louisiana, and did his internal medicine training at Ochsner and cardiology at the Mayo Clinic. He is currently Professor of Medicine and Medical Director of Cardiac Rehab and Prevention and Director of Exercise Laboratories at the John Ochsner Heart and Vascular Institute, Ochsner Clinical School, the University of Queensland School of Medicine in New Orleans. He has authored nearly 1,000 medical publications and 2 cardiology textbooks and serves on 25 editorial boards, including the Journal of American College of Cardiology and the American Journal of Cardiology, and is Associate Editor and Cardiovascular Section Editor of the Mayo Clinic Proceedings. He is also Editor-Chief of Progress in Cardiovascular Diseases and is the author of the book, The Obesity Paradox. With that, I introduce you to Dr. Carl Chip Levy.
Thank you very much. It is certainly a pleasure and honor for me to be here today to discuss one of my favorite topics, that is the impact of physical activity to protect against all-cause mortality and CVD events and mortality. But it is particularly exciting to be able to introduce and promote a revolutionary new technology, Mio Global's Personalized Activity Intelligence, or PAI, which is an innovative way to quantify effective physical activity and to potentially prescribe effective physical activity to protect against all-cause and cardiovascular disease-specific mortality. I think we know from substantial data that physical activity is important. Several years ago, the Lancet Physical Activity Series showed that over 5 million deaths worldwide each year occur due to low physical activity, which is much more than the number of deaths attributed to smoking. Smoking may be worse, but low physical activity is more prevalent, so contributes to more deaths. Another way to look at this is what the global economic cost of physical inactivity is. Almost $70 billion per year in US dollars. More than 70% of the adult population worldwide do not meet physical activity recommendations from national and international experts. Now on this slide, I have one from Wen in Lancet several years ago. When this paper came out, the headlines were that all you had to do was 15 minutes of physical activity to get mortality reduction. So that really raised eyebrows across the globe because people like the idea of doing less and still getting mortality reduction. But this paper also, in 400,000 people from Taiwan who were followed for over a decade, showed a very strong relationship between physical activity and subsequent survival. If you notice that the lines start diverging, especially at around age 60 years, separating those with high physical activity who have low mortality and low physical activity who have considerably more mortality. Now we'll get back to this study later in the presentation. There is also substantial evidence that cardiorespiratory fitness is especially related to survival. It's probably one of the strongest risk factors that there is for not just cardiovascular diseases, but all-cause mortality, even evidence for cancer mortality. As you increase from low levels of fitness to higher levels, you progressively improve survival. Now this goes up to about 10 METs, and that seems to be the magic number where 10 METs you really maximize survival. But other papers show that you even get additional improvements with higher levels of METs, even above 10, although there is somewhat of a diminishing return. But studies certainly show the higher the cardiorespiratory fitness, the higher the estimated METs, the better the survival. And Kodama and colleagues published a famous paper about 8 years ago in JAMA. It's a study of 33 studies of over 100,000 individuals that had 7,000 deaths and many cardiovascular events that really showed how low cardiorespiratory fitness or low estimated METs increased all-cause mortality and CVD, CHD events. For every 1 MET change, mortality and cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease events were affected by about 13% and 15% respectively. When the METs were low, they described this as less than 7.9, although they have different numbers based on age and gender. This was associated with a poor prognosis. And when this was high, 10.8 METs was the cut point again. Different numbers for different ages and genders represents a very good prognosis. So this was an extremely impactful paper published in JAMA 8 years ago. Now, the benefits of exercise are nothing new. Cicero said centuries ago, exercise and temperance can preserve something of our strength in old age. Socrates said it is not bodily habits spoiled by rest and illness, but preserved for a long time by motion and exercise. The Earl of Derby said those who think they have not time for bodily exercise will sooner or later have to find time for illness. And the famous clinician Paul Dudley White that healthy exercise is valuable not only for the maintenance of good physiologic functions of the body, but also mental clarity and feelings of good health. Well, if this is all true, then why do we still see this warning that is propagated amongst our patients and probably the exercise clientele? Before beginning an exercise program, see your clinician to get clearance. It seems like we should have a warning like this. Before beginning a program of sedentary living and isolation from the natural world, you probably should be getting clearance for your physician. You're about to embark on a perilous lifestyle that is dangerous not only to yourself, but also to those around you. Now back to that WIN paper. Remember I said that the highlights were basically right here. 15 minutes of exercise got a 14% mortality reduction. But the paper had a lot more into it than that. It showed that if you did moderate physical activity, basically the more you did, the benefit was greater. The lines certainly start leveling off at well over an hour, but never do totally reach a peak. However, with vigorous physical activity, and they did not define vigorous physical activity as super high. This was not marathon running or triathlon training. They described vigorous activity at about the 7 to 8 MET level. You can see the lines start to level off at a little bit over 30 minutes and certainly reach peak at 40 to 50 minutes, suggesting that for vigorous activity that you might reach a plateau at a fairly early level. And this brought us to a study that we published ourselves in JACC, and this got a lot of publicity in the press a few years ago. It was a big running study of 55,000 people, 13,000 runners versus 42,000 non-runners, followed on average for 15 years. And we showed in this paper that the runners had a reduction in mortality by 30%, and a reduction in cardiovascular mortality by about 45%. Now, this was not a shock. I think that many people would think that running would have beneficial effects on longevity, but also many would also say that the people who are able to run are healthier, and there may be some selection bias, that it could be that just running is associated with better survival. And we showed in this paper that those who were persistent runners got the full benefit. If you started running and stopped, or you were not running but started, you had about half the benefit. Also no big surprise. And we showed that as you ran more, higher doses of running, this is just looking at running time per week, but as you ran more, and we can look at running dose in several different ways, but this is just looking at time. As you ran more and more, your fitness went up. And generally, the fitter you are, the longer you survive. Although you notice that even the lower runners already had pretty good levels of fitness. What was a surprise, though, was when we looked at the running doses. When we looked at different doses of running, we divided the runners into quintiles. 13,000 runners divided into 5 quintiles. We showed that those in quintile 1, which was basically running less than 6 miles per week, running just 1 to 2 times per week, running less than 51 minutes per week, they had the same benefit as those in quintiles 2, 3, and 4, and a trend for slightly more benefit than those in quintile 5, certainly suggesting that more was not better. But the next year, we looked at this further in a Mayo Clinic Proceedings paper, where we basically took the highest quintile runners, those in the top 20%, and divided them into tertiles. So looking at basically the very top 8% of runners. And when we did this, we showed that the very highest dose runners appeared to lose the benefit. Not worse than non-runners, but they had a strong trend toward less benefit than the lower dose runners, and they certainly lost the statistically significant benefits of the running on mortality and cardiovascular mortality. So again, suggesting not only that more is not better, but even raising the possibility that more could be worse. And so as Hippocrates said centuries ago, supporting moderation, if we could give every individual the right amount of nourishment and exercise, not too little, but also not too much, we would have found the safest way to health. And so when we look at training that has been recommended for a long time, typically the training has been continuous exercise. You warm up, you exercise at a certain pace, and then you cool down. But what about the possibility that high-intensity exercise or high-intensity aerobic training, also called high-intensity interval training, could have better effects? Just for example, a warm-up at 40 to 50% of the peak VO2, then an interval at 80 to 90% of the peak VO2, about 85 to 95% of the peak heart rate, a recovery period, and repeating intervals 4 to 6 times, for example, followed by a cool-down period. Could that be better than just continuous exercise? And certainly my friend Dr. Ulrich Wisloff from Norway and others have published many studies that suggest that the high-intensive interval training has better effects on improving cardiorespiratory fitness and better effects on the structure and function of the heart. In this Journal of Cardiopulmonary Rehabilitation paper 7 years ago, they reviewed much of the literature showing typically that compared to moderate intensity exercise, high intensity exercise tends to have better effects at improving the maximal oxygen uptake and improving many parameters of cardiac structure and function. Again, for exercise intensity, you improve it with moderate intensity exercise, but you get greater improvements with high intensities. For many of the LV structure and functional effects, you don't get much effect on with moderate exercise, where you get a lot of effect with high intensity exercise training, which I think many of the exercise scientists strongly believe in. The question is, what is the data to support it based on hard cardiac events? And we actually reviewed, Ross Arena, Jonathan Myers, Dan Foreman, Marco Guazzi, and I reviewed this in a paper in Heart Failure Reviews. We looked for what is the evidence that high-intensity interval training improves prognosis in heart failure patients, for example. And when we reviewed this several years ago, we found that there was just over 100 patients in the literature that had been described receiving this therapy. They appeared to get benefits, but again, nothing enough to really quantify the efficacy and safety of this type of exercise training, at least in patients with cardiovascular diseases. But now we have something new. The physical activity intelligence, or the personalized activity intelligence. I've had the pleasure of working with my good friend Dr. Ulrich Wisloff of the K.G. Jensen Center of Exercises Medicine, which is perhaps the top center for exercise sciences in the world, located within the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And they describe the personalized activity intelligence, or PAI, which represents a new standard for activity tracking. And I had the privilege of visiting their center 2 years ago, and I will be returning to visit their center and chair a session at one of their exercise meetings and give a lecture in December. And I'm really looking forward to returning to this very top exercise center. But brings up, what kind of physical activity advice should we be given to our patients and clients? The current recommendations for physical activity, the federal guidelines used in the United States and much of the world, suggest that at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity, or about 75 minutes of vigorous intensity activity per week, or any combination that approximates the same total energy expenditure, should be our recommendation. But we know from many studies that although physical activity is very important, if you look at people that are physically inactive compared to those who are physically active, or you quantify degrees of physical activity, there generally are progressive improvements in prognosis as you increase levels of physical activity, maybe up to a point and with a threshold with certain high amounts of physical activity in some of the slides I showed earlier. But we also know that cardiorespiratory fitness outperforms physical activity as a predictor of future health. The association between physical activity and mortality, in fact, disappear typically after adjustment for cardiorespiratory fitness, whereas the benefits of having high CRF for cardiorespiratory fitness remain also among those not fulfilling current physical activity recommendations. So certainly suggesting that fitness is more important than just cardiorespiratory fitness. Now granted, one of the ways that people get fitter is to do more physical activity, and particularly to do more high intensity physical activity. But there is some inherited or non-physical activity component of cardiorespiratory fitness. We know sometimes that two people could be doing exactly the same activity, but one is fitter. One would win the race if they went on a head-on competition. So we need to motivate people to be more physically active, but particularly to focus on physical activity that improves their fitness, particularly to focus on physical activity that improves their health outcomes, things like cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular mortality, and all-cause mortality. Now, at present, we have a lot of equipment. We have a lot of wearables and fitness apps that in many different ways can monitor one's physical activity. Certainly we have timers, we have step counters, we have calorie counters, many different devices that in different ways will monitor one's total physical activity. But goals such as 10,000 steps, or 15,000 steps if you even want to do better, or 30 minutes of activity per day tend to be vague. And the steps don't tell you how fast you have to go, just total number. And they do not necessarily reflect the body's response to each particular activity. And just for example, for steps, there are many forms of physical activity that don't necessarily involve steps, and certainly that don't involve fast steps. And even though everyone tries really hard with very different devices and applications, there really still is no simple way to tell exactly how active one is, or how active one needs to be to stay healthy, to promote health, to prevent cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disease morbidity and mortality, as well as all-cause mortality. There certainly is no standard. The race then is about giving one the most advanced information and to show that everything that is possible with today's technology just because it is possible. Now, heart rate is a way that reflects the body's response to any type of physical activity, one that involves steps or other physical activities that are not necessarily step responsive. Anything that increases heart rate is typically having a beneficial effect on cardiovascular performance. Everybody measures heart rate, but typically no one tells the patients, no one tells the clients what this really means. So the scientific question is, can we make a meaningful heart rate metric for effective physical activity tracking that could translate into lower risk of lifestyle diseases? Can we make a meaningful heart rate metric that could promote the type of physical activity that would be effectively lowering one's risk of lifestyle diseases, cardiovascular disease, morbidity, and mortality? Now, I mentioned Ulrich Wisloff before and his data from Norway, and they have many big studies. One of them has been the Hunt study. And in the Hunt study from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, about 4,600 from the Hunt fitness study were involved, and an algorithm was derived, and this is the derivation cohort, on measured heart rate during a fitness test, as well as very detailed questions related to the frequency, duration, and intensity of physical activity during a typical week. And again, this is the data from the derivation cohort that was used to develop the Personalized Activity Intelligence, or PAI, scoring system. A PAI scale from 0 to 100 was strongly related to health status, where a low PAI of less than 50 per week was associated with high levels of cardiovascular risk factors, things like hypertension, elevated pressure, high blood glucose, high cholesterol, and more obesity, whereas the higher PAI scores were associated with better health status and lower amounts of the cardiovascular risk factors. And then the algorithm from the derivation cohort was validated in close to 40,000 Norwegian men and women from the Hunt study who were followed for mortality and cardiovascular mortality for a median of 26.2 years, where there were 10,062 deaths and 3,867 deaths from cardiovascular disease. Almost 1 million hours or person years of observations were made in this cohort during the length of this trial. And I recently had the privilege of co-authoring this study in the American Journal of Medicine called the Personalized Activity Intelligence, or PAI, for the prevention of cardiovascular disease and the promotion of physical activity. Using the algorithm where PAI points were accumulated by heart rates obtained during a typical week or during a week of follow-up, they showed that those who achieved 100 PAI had a much better survival than those achieving lower amounts of PAI, whereas those who achieved half of this value, 50 weekly PAI, had about 60 to 80% of the benefit. Particularly early on, they had most of the benefit. As the study went on for close to a median of 26 years, the curves are widening. But with lower amounts of PAI, either inactive people had no PAI, or those who had pretty low levels of 30 PAI, they did not seem to have the benefit. Men and women with a weekly 100 PAI lived on average about 5 years longer than those with less than 30 weekly PAI. And particularly, this was noted in the younger individuals where the mean survival was 7 years longer. In those over age 70, it was about 2 years longer, but certainly a significant benefit in having a higher PAI. Overall, those who achieved 100 PAI had approximately 15% reductions in all-cause mortality and 20% reductions in cardiovascular disease mortality during follow-up. Importantly, those who achieved PAI but didn't meet the requirements for physical activity guidelines, meaning they didn't meet the 75 minutes per week of vigorous or 150 minutes per week of moderate physical activity, they still got the same benefit. Whereas those who met the physical activity requirements but who didn't achieve 100 PAI had a 27% higher cardiovascular disease mortality, suggesting that PAI was superior to the physical activity guidelines of just meeting the time requirements with regard to at least predicting subsequent cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. Most of the effect, as I mentioned, was those who started at younger ages, between 55 and 60. They lived an average of 7 years longer, whereas the 70-year-olds lived an average of about 2 years longer if they achieved the 100 PAI level. And the benefits of achieving PAI based on the physical activity, based on the heart rate responses to physical activity, were especially noted in those who had cardiovascular risk factors. The smokers, about a 30% reduction in cardiovascular risk, 30% reductions in the hypertensives and the overweight, and the diabetics even had the most reductions, greater than 50% reductions in cardiovascular disease risk if they achieved the 100 PAI cut point. And again, this paper was published earlier this year in the American Journal of Medicine. Now, we know it's talked a lot about that sitting is now the new smoking. So besides promoting physical activity, there's also a lot of talk about sedentary time is contributing to cardiovascular disease risk and mortality. And recently in my journal, I'm the editor-in-chief of Progress in Cardiovascular Diseases, the July-August issue, we had a whole issue on physical activity, exercise, and fitness for improving health, edited by Dr. Ulrich Wisloff and myself. And in this issue, Nina Zisko published a paper also looking at PAI and how it related to cardiovascular risk factor clustering and how PAI was associated or interacted with sedentary time. And obviously, in an ideal world, one would be very physically active, but also not have a high amount of sedentary time. But we see here that regardless of age, the younger individuals under age 44, the 45 to 59-year-olds, as well as the 60-year-olds, as you have more sedentary time, you increase the amount of risk factor clustering, combining things like the blood pressure and the sugar abnormalities, the cholesterol abnormalities, or the cardiometabolic disease. Whereas for any amount of sedentary time, having higher amounts of PAI, particularly PAI above 100, was very protective and almost eliminated the risk of increased sedentary time on at least the cardiometabolic risk factors. And although the magic number was 100, they showed in this paper that even those who achieved 50 PAI had substantial benefits for protection against cardiometabolic disease, even associated with higher amounts of sedentary time. So the personalized activity intelligence that was generated from Dr. Ulrich Wisloff and his colleagues in the Hunt study has been developed now by MyoGlobal into a wearable technology to slice. And the following assumptions become used to formulate the basis of the PAI model design. First, its intensity of exercise at the individual level is approximately assessed by using the percentage of heart rate reserve, which is the heart rate relative to the resting heart rate and maximal heart rate, using peak heart rate minus resting heart rate over the maximal heart rate. Now, in this technology, if one does not know their maximal heart rate, it will be identified by formulas based on age and gender. But if you can get a maximal heart rate, that can be put in the device. Likewise, resting heart rate can also be estimated, but if you're wearing the technology while you sleep, the device will also get the individual's own resting heart rate, which is the slowest heart rate. Second, very low intensity exercise, we know, does not typically contribute much to cardiorespiratory fitness, suggesting that a threshold exists before PAI can be accumulated. So very low amounts of exercise that do not raise heart rate, or another way to say this is very slow steps, would not be increasing PAI. Third, increased intensity has been shown to dramatically reduce the amount of exercise needed to increase cardiorespiratory fitness, suggesting a nonlinear scaling of intensity for the model. Fourth, exercise level is fundamentally a product of intensity and time, where assessment from a continuous data stream of heart rate, the heart rate can be generated for every single heartbeat during the day, is achieved by integrating the nonlinear scale intensity over time. Fifth, the effective exercise is most prominent when an inactive individual who's inactive at baseline increases the physical activity, which then increases level, And this shows a gradual decaying effect on CRF improvement. So you get the maximum effect to improve CRF as you go from inactive to low amounts of physical activity. And last, when an individual eventually increases their cardiorespiratory fitness, the resting heart rate falls, as well as the heart rate during submaximal physical activity also becomes reduced, meaning that then the absolute levels of physical activity needed to reach the higher heart rates that generate more PAI becomes higher. So it is easier to get the first 50 PAI per week than it is to get the next 50 PAI. So PAI is a simple metric based on personal profile and heart rate data that guides people on how active they need to be to stay healthy. The benefits of PAI is that it's simple. It's easy to understand, providing a single metric to track. And one has their PAI for the previous week. So if the goal is to get at least 50 PAI, but preferably to get 100 PAI, and it's cumulative over a week. So one can get their PAI in 2 doses. If one exercise a little bit every day, they can get it in their daily workouts. If one just does an exercise every 4 or 5 days, they could get all of their PAI in those 2 workouts. Typically, doing 10,000 steps at a very slow pace would typically generate about 40 PAIs per week. Whereas doing intensity that is 75% of the heart rate reserve, it would take about 60 minutes to achieve 100 PAI. And doing high intense exercise where the heart rate is about 85% of the heart rate reserve, it would typically take only 40 minutes of weekly exercise to achieve the 100 PAI. This is scientific. It's based on a huge health study that I was fortunate to co-author and proven to positively impact health. It's meaningful. It provides key insights showing effectiveness of any physical activity that one is doing. That could be gardening, that could be swimming, that could be elliptical machine, bicycle, walking, jogging. It's universal. It works for all fitness levels because PAI is personalized to the individual based on their age, gender, resting heart rate, and the heart rates they achieve during physical activity. It's adaptive. As people progress, it keeps them challenged because it then takes higher intensity to achieve the higher heart rates, to achieve higher numbers of PAI. And it's tracked over 7 days, providing a lot of flexibility around busy schedules. So if one goes 3 and 4 days without doing a lot of physical activity, they still can have their PAI from the previous week. And so one can get their PAI points in 2, 3, or 4 workouts per week. How PAI works, it's based on an individual's personal profile and the heart rate collected during their physical activity over the past 7 days with a continuous running total. And maintaining a PAI score of 100 or more has been scientifically proven to provide maximum benefits, although certainly it does appear that somewhere between 60 to 80% of the benefit is achieved with just the first 50 PAI, which is much easier to obtain than the 100 PAI. It's an individual profile with gender, age, maximum, and resting heart rate data. The algorithm is based on a large population followed for over 25 years. It's 7 days of heart rate data based on one of the largest health studies that I was fortunate enough to co-publish. And it produces risk reductions of in the range of 20 to 25% to reduce cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. Certainly any physical activity is better than no physical activity. And there is data to show that increasing steps is associated with better prognosis. But not all steps are created the same. And just to show an example, Jane on day 1 activity tracks over 10,000 steps, but she actually only earned 5 PAI points since she walked a couple hours, but only at a very leisurely pace that did not produce significant increases in heart rate. Whereas on day 2, she earned 50 PAI in a very small amount of time, as her heart rate was elevated during the majority of the physical activity, giving her more health benefits with fewer steps and in less time. With only 3,800 steps, she got 50 PAI points, whereas the day before she did 10,000 steps and only got 5 PAI points. Because it's the heart rate that produces the benefit. And so the MyoSlice is featuring the PAI technology. The Slice Heart Rate Activity Tracker is the first wearable to capture your heart rate data all day and translate it into a readily available PAI score that's updated continuously over the previous week. PAI is personalized activity intelligence. It gets real-time heart rate data feedback score. It's Myo heart rate technology. It gives accurate heart rate monitoring 24/7. Activity tracking. It tracks steps, distance, calories burned. It monitors sleep quality and resting heart rates. It has smartphone notifications. You can receive phone calls and text message alerts. It's water resistant up to fairly deep amounts of water, so one can swim with this activity tracker. And the PAI apps are available in several different forms. You can sync with the MyoSlice and sync your activity data from the MyoSlice. You can view your PAI score and know your score for the previous 7 days earned. It gives you the current heart rate as well as the heart rate that you were having when you were accumulating PAI. The PAI earned, the distance, the calories, the steps, and sleep time, different phases of sleep. So many different things can be monitored with this MyoSlice, with this PAI technology. So tips for earning PAI. The first 50 PAI are easier to earn than once you approach 100 or beyond 100, and this is due to the law of diminishing returns. So to do the exact same physical activity, the first 50 PAI are easier than the next 50. Maintaining 100 PAI gives you maximum health benefits, but as I've said, it's much easier to get 50, and you tend to get about 60 to maybe as much as 80% of the health benefits with the first 50. Since PAI is based on your heart rate during any physical activity, the fitter you are, the harder it will be to earn PAI. So PAI is a great equalizer and is appropriate for all levels of fitness. You can only earn a maximum of 75 PAI per day. This is the way it's set up because there's evidence that doing at least 2 episodes of physical activity per week are needed to maximize health benefits. The higher your heart rate, the faster you will earn PAI points, so it motivates people to push themselves harder to maximize the effectiveness from their workouts. And PAI is also based on an individual's resting heart rate. To be sure, it's important to wear the slice during sleep to get an accurate reading of the true resting heart rate. Otherwise, it can be approximated in the app using gender and age. But again, the ideal would be to get the individual's true, at least resting heart rate. And another idea would be to get the true peak heart rate for the individual, because we know there's formulas that will give the estimated maximal heart rate based on age and gender, but individuals can be way off, and just if you use a simple formula, this isn't a formula used in the device, but if you just used a simple one, 220 minus the age, that would say a 40-year-old should have 180 peak heart rate. Well, we know some 40-year-olds have a 200 peak heart rate, and some 40-year-olds have 160 peak heart rate. So it's important that, or ideal at least, for one to get their true peak heart rate, and that can be entered into the device. Certainly, it's very important for all of us to promote physical activity throughout the healthcare system, throughout our practices. We had a very major paper that's been heavily cited, published in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings a couple of years ago. And as the reference, if anyone wants this paper, this is, I think, a good gauge. It shows how so many people are not meeting physical activity levels, and so many health professionals are not appropriately encouraging patients and clients to increase their physical activity. As I mentioned earlier, I've been editor-in-chief of Progress in Cardiovascular Diseases since 2014, and we just had a very top issue come out. The July-August issue of Progress in Cardiovascular Disease is co-edited by Dr. Ulrich Wisloff and myself on physical activity, exercise, and fitness in health and disease. And I believe this is probably my best issue since I've been editor of this journal. And it's now a very highly rated journal, ranked 9th of 130 cardiovascular journals. And another way of ratings, it's rated 5th of 330 cardiovascular related type journals. So it's got very high ratings, and I think this is going to be my best issue ever on physical activity and exercise. So in conclusion, I think many of us hear this throughout the day as this patient is telling his clinician, "Give it to me straight, doc. How long do I have to ignore your advice?" Many people say the reason they're not achieving good physical activity levels is that they don't have time. But if there's time to live, there's time to be physically active. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dr. Levy. We did get a ton of questions, and we've got a couple minutes to address a few of them. Like I mentioned before in the opening, if you did submit a question through the question box online, we will do our best to get to a handful of them now, and then we will take those questions, and Dr. Levy will answer them in a blog post that we'll post on the ACSM website. So with that, first question comes in: how does PAI compare to step counting, and have you seen a difference in the results with your patients?
Yes, I mean, I had a slide on that. Is that, you know, certainly any physical activity is better than no physical activity, and so somebody who's not getting many steps, if they increase their number of steps, that's a good thing. And certainly we'd like all individuals to shoot toward getting 10,000 steps. Maybe even ideally it might be even getting 15,000 steps. The thing is, though, that not all steps are created equal. One can do fast steps like in a run. You know, typically if, you know, to get 10,000 steps, it's about 5 miles of movement. And that's a good amount of physical activity. But a 5-mile run with a higher heart rate is going to generate a lot of PAI. Whereas a very slow 5-mile walk, and let me just exaggerate, 5 miles walked over 3 hours. That's with very low heart rates and would probably generate very little PAI. And so to maximize the PAI, you have to increase the heart rate. And so it would be possible to get a lot fewer steps. For example, a 2-mile or 3-mile run at a faster pace wouldn't achieve 10,000 steps, but could get considerably more PAI points than was obtained with very slow steps. So again, it seems that PAI, which has been proven to be better than the national guidelines for time, that has not been the case with steps. Certainly there is data to show that higher steps is associated with better health. But I don't know that there's data showing that higher steps is better than the federal activity guidelines. STEPS is just a way to quantify one's physical activity, whereas PAI has actually been shown to be superior. I mentioned earlier that if you achieve 100 PAI, but you don't achieve the minutes per week guidelines, you still have the maximum benefit. Vice versa, if you achieve the minutes per week guideline, but you don't obtain the 100 PAI, you had a 27% higher cardiovascular mortality. So it appears that certainly PAI is superior to just time of exercise.
Great, thanks for that. Another question in regards to PAI. Does PAI work for everyone, regardless of age or health?
Yes, that's a nice thing about PAI, that in the formulas, it has age and gender, so age is factored in, gender is factored in, and the other things that are factored in is the resting heart rate and maximal heart rate. So for any level of fitness, any age, any gender, any type of physical activity, PAI is going to be counting the increase in one's heart rate. Now, so if you take a typical person that has a resting heart rate of 60 and their maximum heart rate is 160, that's a difference of 100. Well, if they're exercising at a heart rate of 140, they are going to be achieving a lot of PAI points. If they're exercising at a heart rate of 80 or 90, they're not going to be getting many PAI points. Now, on the other hand, if somebody had a heart rate of 50, but their maximum heart rate is only 100, well, then that person would be getting a lot of PAI points with a heart rate of only 85 to 90. So it is very individualized based on a person's age and gender and their own maximum and peak heart rates.
Okay. I think you may have mentioned this a little bit earlier as well, but the next question is relative to the 100 PAI. How hard is it to maintain the 100 PAI? Like, how much exercise do you need to do in order to hit that number?
Yeah, so I did say, for example, that typically exercise, if one is exercising at about 75% of their heart rate reserve, it would take about 60 minutes of exercise to achieve the 100 PAI. If you're exercising at 85% of your maximum heart rate, which of course would be pretty intense exercise, it only takes about 40 minutes to achieve 100 PAI. Now, obviously, both of those, 40 versus 60, is way less than the 150 per week recommendations for moderate exercise, or even, you know, the 40 and 60 is both less than the 75 minutes of high intensity exercise. Now, saying that, I mean, you do have to raise the heart rate to get the PAI. If somebody just walks a very slow amount of exercise daily and gets 10,000 steps, but at a very slow pace, you know, many days a week, they may still only get 30, 40, 50 PAI. So it is pretty easy to get the first 50 PAI, but getting the next 50 does require some exercise being done at higher percentage of the heart rate. So just a continuous, very slow exercise that doesn't increase heart rate much would not allow one to easily obtain the 100 PAI.
And are there benefits to going above 100 PAI?
In the study that we did in the American Journal of Medicine, again published earlier this year, we showed that you appeared to get no additional benefit as you went well over 100 PAI. That's in a way supportive of our running data. If you remember, I talked about our running paper in the 2014 JACC, which showed that it appeared that with high intensity exercise, you do tend to maximize out the benefits early. We have not shown that there was any harm of going above 100 pi, but doing 125, 150 pi, 200 pi does not appear to produce at least more cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality reductions compared to 100 pi. Now, saying that, there certainly is the possibility that could provide more calorie burning, and more calorie burning could allow people to eat more. If you're competitive and you're trying to win races or lower your racing times, you might be able to improve your performance by doing more intensive exercise and therefore achieving more pi. But at least with regard to cardiovascular disease mortality and all-cause mortality, you seem to benefit maximally at about 100 pi.
Okay, and then the last question is sort of piggybacking on that a little bit. What's the significance of the number 100? You know, what about 35, 50, 75, 125? What's the significance of 100 pi?
Yeah, you know, as I've said several times, I think in the questions as well as in the lecture, you know, there's no question that any physical activity is better than no physical activity. And certainly my friend Steve Blair said many times that probably the biggest threat to health in the 21st century is physical inactivity. And the best physical activity, he often says, is the one that a person's actually going to do. But I would add to that, the best physical activity is one that the person's going to do that increases the heart rate to allow one to get pi. And so the significance is that at least in our data, it appears that you get 60 to 80% of the benefit at the 50 pi. But I showed a slide that at 30 pi, there was not an obvious benefit over the physically inactive group. So at 50 pi, you got about 60 to 80% of the benefit. And, you know, we didn't really study 75 pi, but I'm assuming you'd get a little bit, you know, greater at 75 pi than you get at 50. But you appeared to maximize the benefit at about 100 pi. And again, getting higher than 100 pi, and we did evaluate that, there did not appear to be any significant additional benefits. Again, remembering that we were specifically studying cardiovascular disease mortality and all-cause mortality. We were not necessarily studying every other possible endpoint. There certainly could be some other endpoints, but at least with regard to cardiovascular disease mortality and all-cause mortality, it appeared you got 60 to 80% of the benefit with 50 pi and the full benefit with 100 pi.
Great. Well, we're creeping up on the 3 o'clock Eastern hour, so we're almost out of time. I just want to thank MyoGlobal and Dr. Levy again. I thought the presentation was awesome. So on behalf of ACSM, thank you very much. As a final reminder to all the attendees, email link to the CEC for attending this, along with a recorded version of the webinar and a link to Dr. Levy's slides, will be emailed to you guys tomorrow afternoon. So look for that email around the 2, 3 o'clock time, Eastern time tomorrow, with links to all those different things. So with that, again, thank you guys very much for attending. This concludes the webinar. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.